And now, without any further ado, I'm honored to introduce AFL President Alan Hoffman.
Thank you, Chuck. It is my role and privilege to introduce our panelists today, Lloyd Kramer and Mike Duncan. Lloyd is a longtime member of the American Friends of Lafayette. He is a professor of history and director of Carolina Public Humanities at UNC Chapel Hill. He received his PhD from Cornell University and served previously as chair of the history department at UNC Chapel Hill. His research and teaching focus is on European history, with particular attention to modern France and the Atlantic world. Lloyd earned his spurs in Lafayette scholarship at Cornell University. He studied under Stanley Azerta and worked with Stan Azerta and our own Robert Kraut, President Emeritus of the American Friends of Lafayette, on the Lafayette Papers, which ultimately resulted in a 5-volume collection of papers relating to Lafayette during the American Revolution, actually from 1776 to 1790. His major contribution to the literature of Lafayette and to the intellectual history of the early 19th century is entitled Lafayette in Two Worlds: Public Cultures and Personal Identities in an Age of Revolution. I met Lloyd, and I remember the date because it was an occasion, on Lafayette's birthday, September 6, 2007, at the banquet at Lafayette College in honor of the General's 250th birthday, where we were seated at the same table to listen to David McCullough give the keynote address. I had read Lloyd's book sometime before, but did not make the connection between the book and my table companion until, in the midst of making what I thought was a particularly incisive point about Lafayette, I said, "Lloyd, I think I just quoted Kramer to Kramer." I got to know Lloyd better in 2015 when we were both bus companions and table companions during the wonderful Lafayette tour, the tour of Lafayette sites in France, run by who else? Chuck Schwam and Bonnie Fritz. And we spent a fair amount of time together. So it is with the authority of personal knowledge that I can truly attest that Lloyd Kramer is both a gentleman and a scholar. I will now turn to Mike Duncan, who I don't know as well, but hope to someday. Mike Duncan is a history podcaster and best-selling author. He started by pursuing his childhood interest in ancient civilizations with his podcast, The History of Rome, which lasted from 2007 to 2012 and included 107 episodes. This podcast was downloaded over 100 million times. It was awarded Best Educational Podcast by the People's Choice Podcast Awards in 2010. Mike's first book resulted from the podcast. It's called The Storm Before the Storm, and it covered the period predating the fall of the Roman Republic. This book appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. Mike's second podcast, commencing in 2013, was called, or is called, Revolutions. Starting from the English Revolution, the podcast has covered most of the important revolutions in the modern era, including the American Revolution, the French Revolution of 1789, and the July Revolution in 1830. Mike's early interest in the American Revolution, it was his favorite period of American history, coupled with Lafayette's Zelig-like presence in the aforementioned revolutions, likely impelled Mike to relocate to France, learn the French language, and spend 3 years studying Lafayette so that he could tell his story. Voila, Mike's second book, Hero of Two Worlds, The Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution, is here. This book has already appeared on the New York Times bestselling list and was #1 on both the Boston Globe's list and the Washington Post list. Since one of the principal goals of the American Friends of Lafayette is to bring the importance of Lafayette's life and career to a wider audience, we are thrilled that Mike's book is doing so well. We are also delighted that Mike is here to talk some Lafayette with Professor Kramer. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alan. It is a pleasure to be here. And it's a particular pleasure for me to join with Mike Duncan. I have the book right here. I travel with it. I tell my friends about it. And I hope all of you who are watching will purchase the book. In fact, I think Bonnie is going to put in the chat some information about how you can purchase it. So I particularly want to thank Mike for being here because he is committed to the public history and public humanities that is so important for our time. So the format is we are going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and I'm going to ask a series of questions. And then at the end of that time, we're going to open the floor for comments and questions from the audience and continue to build the conversation at that point. We may share a few images as well, but I want to begin simply by asking Mike the question that inquiring minds want to know. Why did you become interested in Lafayette? And what aspects of his life and actions made you want to write a big book about him?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for having me. It's a thrill and an honor to be amongst the Friends of Lafayette, of whom I am also a friend of Lafayette. But my interest in Lafayette ultimately grows organically out of producing my podcast series, where each season of the podcast covers a different historical revolution. And I knew when I was producing my series on the American Revolution, which is the second season, that I would be moving forward and doing, like the next one I would do would be about the French Revolution. And so I paid particular attention to anybody who was showing up in the American Revolution who would show up later in the series for season 3 on the French Revolution. Lafayette, of course, being one of those, the other big one being Tom Paine. So I spent I paid a lot of attention to Tom Paine at the same time. Then when I sort of left the American Revolution behind and started doing my really in-depth research and reading about the French Revolution, one of the things that struck me right in the face was how differently Lafayette is portrayed in terms of his experiences in the French Revolution and his role in the French Revolution versus his experience in the American Revolution and all attendant activities in the United States. Where you read books about the American Revolution, no matter who's writing them, they're going to say, he was a pretty good guy. He was this kid. He came over. He helped us out. He's Washington's surrogate son. Like he was this beloved puppy dog who's bouncing around. Everybody likes him. And then you move over to the French Revolution, and this isn't even just the way that French historians view him or French society views him today. This is really anybody who's writing about the French Revolution. The first book I read was William Doyle's Oxford History of the French Revolution, just to get an overview. And I mean, he didn't let an opportunity pass to be like Lafayette, who was asleep at the switch, Lafayette, who was a bumbling fool, Lafayette, who was in over his head, and I was just like, is this actually the same guy? This is crazy. He appears to have lost all his mojo, having traveled back across the Atlantic. And so that right there, that sort of historiographic, the two different versions of him, obviously he's just one guy. But those two facets really became interesting to me. And then when I wrote the book, what I'm trying to do here is to tell one coherent narrative. He was just one person traveling through his life. He didn't suddenly become a different person in 1789. And then as the podcast unfolded, I'm writing episodes about Spanish American independence, which has nothing to do with Lafayette, except I'm reading biographies of Bolivar, and suddenly Simon Bolivar's in regular correspondence with the old Marquis de Lafayette. I'm writing about the Haitian Revolution, and I find Lafayette in correspondence with the president of Free Haiti. And then I get into 1830, and he's running Carbonari conspiracies against Louis XVIII. And then he's a major player in the Revolution of 1830. He's not just some, little side piece. I think he, more than anybody else, is the reason why the Orleanists win the Revolution of 1830. So by this point, he's everywhere. He's a fascinating figure. And then that just so happened to be right when my first book did very well. And I was thinking about what my next book was going to be. And I was just like, I want to go back to the beginning and redo everything through the eyes of Lafayette, because I really do think that he's a fascinating figure and representative of an incredibly important period in history.
So I think that's one of the interesting things about your book, the way you try to look at the world in part through Lafayette's eyes, but you're also always telling us how other people viewed him as well. So he's a kind of historical figure upon whom people project all kinds of expectations.
Absolutely.
I wonder if you could go a little further on this idea of Lafayette's reputation and tell us a little more about what you see as Lafayette's greatest achievements, but also as Lafayette's greatest failures. Because as you say, Americans tend to focus on his achievements and the French tend to focus on his failures. Where do we find the real, is there such a thing as the real Lafayette?
Sure. I mean, sure. He had his successes and he had his failures. And I do think, one of the things that I came to the conclusion of is that I think that Americans do have a tendency to overrate Lafayette, just in the sense that he can become a bit mythologized and turned into a bit of sort of a legendary icon as opposed to what he was, which is a real human being. And at the same time, the French have a tendency to really underrate him and only focus on the times when things went bad around him, some of which I dug into and was like, I don't even think this is Lafayette's fault. I just think they're blaming him for stuff. But I mean, I think clearly his greatest accomplishment is in representing and sort of planting a flag inside the consciousness of really what ultimately becomes world history, with the ideals that he represented and the reforms that he wanted to see enacted, which includes constitutional government, a declaration, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. These things that we now take for granted as the bedrock of our political institutions didn't exist when he was active on the scene. When he comes back to France from fighting in the United States, there's no constitution, there's no Declaration of Rights. Those things need to be put in place. And he aggressively moves to put those things in place and does so when he first delivers his draft of the Declaration of Rights on July the 11th, 1789. He does so believing that it's very possible a conservative counter-revolution is about to take place, that there's going to be sort of a reactionary coup against the revolution. The National Assembly is going to be purged. He himself might wind up either proscribed or exiled or dead. But believing that the National Assembly needed to make a great statement of principle to say, this is what we stand for. And he does this. I think he accomplishes this. He represents this. And even to this day, the Declaration of the Rights of Man then becomes, the foundation of the UN's human rights, right? They're using much of the same language. And I think he planted a lot of those flags along the way that then become the North Stars that we continue to sort of judge our own political institutions by. In that sense, he was very, very successful at establishing his idea for the world, becoming what the world becomes. Now, at the same time, when it comes to his failures, he was operating inside of an incredibly fluid and an incredibly dynamic and incredibly dangerous political waters in 1789, 1790, 1791. He's trying to firmly establish at that moment in history a constitutional monarchy with guaranteed civil rights. And in this, he fails. He did not pull it off. Whether a better politician, whether a more astute organizer could have done a better job in his shoes is, we'll never know, because history only happened the one way. But he definitely had a program that he was trying to set in place specifically for the French in 1789, that then just events and other factions and other leaders overtake him. He can't fight against it. He can't withdraw from it. It just happens around him, and he loses the plot completely and winds up, obviously having to run away from the French Revolution. So like at the same time that he's planting these grand ideals that continue to guide us in terms of the specific political project he was trying to achieve, it didn't happen for him.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at the successes and the failures and you think about him as a human being, which part of that story makes him feel more human to you, and which part makes him seem kind of unreal? And in other words, does his humanity come through more when he fails or when he succeeds?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I think, and I don't want to, I don't want to be mealy mouthed here, but I do think that it's both. Nobody succeeds all the time. Nobody fails all the time. Every one of us, every human being has the things that we look back on that we did well, that we're happy to have achieved and can look back on with pride. And then we all have things that we wince at, that we tried to do and it didn't work. That, we even blame ourselves. Like I probably could have done something differently in that situation and have it led to a better outcome. And this is where I was trying to, and I hope I succeeded in the book with unifying these two sides of him, because many times, like I've read many biographies of Lafayette now, and some of them are very hagiographic, and the whole he's just walking around with this glow around him, often written by Americans. And then there's this other version where the author can't seem to wait to get in a dig and say, oh, he failed at this and he failed at this and he wasn't up to snuff and he was a pygmy surrounded by giants, and like little quotes like that. And I don't think either one of those is true. He's very human in both his successes and his failures, because that's who we are as people.
So when you look at him in the French Revolution and in the American Revolution and even the Revolution of 1830, do you think he does different things in those revolutions, or does he always try to do the same thing? Is he ever different, or is he always the same?
He's definitely the same guy. And I see, in 1830, I think a lot of what is motivating him in that summer and in the years leading up to it is, I think he does feel like it was a big swing and miss in 1789. Like he took a big cut and he swung and missed. And then and instead of just, like having to go back to the dugout, I guess, is the prison in Old Moots. Okay. So if we can expand that metaphor to its breaking point. But I think that what he was trying to do in 1830 was accomplish what he had failed to accomplish in 1789, which is have this constitutional monarchy with a Declaration of Rights, a monarchy surrounded by Republican institutions, which he believed was about the maximum amount that French culture and French society could handle. He obviously has he himself believes that he's a Republican, right? And because he loves the United States and he wants that ultimately for France, but he doesn't think that the French can handle it. And of course, the experience of the First French Republic in the early 1790s, with them almost killing him and almost killing his wife and killing half of his family, he does walk out of the French Revolution not having the happiest feelings about republicanism as a political movement. So he tries to do this. And I think that ultimately then at the same time, he winds up making kind of the same mistakes, where the constitutional monarchy of, what becomes the July monarchy, he believes will then be the foundation point for further reform, because he doesn't think that, anything should stop. And he sort of naively accepts a few things. And the through line for him, in terms of his political mistakes, is that he tends to view politics as a theater where virtuous individual actors come together and in a disinterested way analyze the issues of the day or the policies of the day and come to a decision for themselves as individuals about what would be best for the group. And he's opposed in a certain way to organizing and to factions and to joining political parties. And he tries to stand aloof to all of that. And both in 1789 and in 1830, this winds up sort of maneuvering him into a place that he doesn't want to be, because other people are happy to organize in groups. And they will get together in a room and plot strategy before they go into like a legislative assembly or go into the Chamber of Delegates, in a way that Lafayette struggled with all through his life, to really act in an organized political way. He does it, he's in the Carbonari, but that also did never quite get off the ground. So it's I think in 1830, he's the same person trying to achieve what he achieved in 1830. And I think a lot of what maneuvers him out of the 1830 revolution is a lot of what led him to get kicked out of the French Revolution.
So you think in each of these revolutionary situations, his origins as a French aristocrat, as a nobleman, made it difficult or even impossible for him to understand the passion of the lower classes, the popular classes. And so he got into jam, like with the situation of the Champ de Mars, the massacre of the Champ de Mars in 1791, or perhaps he was too quick to give up on a more Republican model in 1830 because he didn't ultimately trust the lower classes.
I think that there is something to that. Yes, he is. He's a great liberal philanthropist. He's very much, he's not somebody who is, he's not haughty. He's not disdainful of anything or anybody. And I do believe that he genuinely doesn't believe that like some people are above other people, right? I mean, some of this is obviously like he is raised in the French aristocracy of the Ancien regime. So some of this he's never going to be able to shed. But when it comes to his views on race, he does not ever think that Africans are inherently inferior to white people in a way that many of his contemporaries did, even those in like the abolitionist spheres believe, well, okay, well, they're inferior, but we should help them anyway. I don't think Lafayette ever was into that way of thinking. I don't think he was into that way of thinking with what you would call just like peasants or poor people in the streets. I don't really ever get the sense from him that he did not sincerely believe in the equality of all human beings. The people that he was opposed to was not the people who were being roused. It was the people who were doing the rabble rousing. He did believe that there were these sort of cynical populists who were using the passions and the energies of the people for nefarious or selfish purposes. And that's where I think he really identifies his fear. It's not a fear of the people themselves. It's a fear of the people who would want to use those people. And in this, I think that he does have, there's some justification for his fear of those people. And you talk about, the massacre of the Champ de Mars, which is another, you could put that on his, that's definitely on sort of the side of his failures. He oversees the massacre of a bunch of people, which happens in the context of him constantly riding out into Paris and people taking shots at him. On the day of the daggers, I think he dodges at least 3 assassination attempts. He's not riding around out there amidst like a group of people who are just like cheering for him. In the end, people are literally trying to kill him and trying to kill his family, trying to kill his wife and kids. So I think a lot of that experience in the 1790s does mark him in 1830 in a way that that does lead him. But he's also afraid that like Britain and Prussia will invade again if they go with Republican. There's sort of wider reasons why he doesn't want to go Republican. Right. Yeah.
Well, I think his fear of demagogues and authoritarians is well taken, and he's learned that also from Napoleon and seeing what someone can do by manipulating power. You mentioned his view of race, and I wanted to get to this issue because this is, of course, one of the very important issues for our own generation. How would you describe Lafayette's views of slavery and his efforts to abolish it? Or to put it another way, how does he resemble or differ from abolitionists of his own time or of a later time?
Okay, so the baseline is that by 1783, Lafayette is just an abolitionist, right? He believes that the abolition of slavery is necessary. He believes that it's inevitable, and he wants to participate in the process of taking the world from a place where there is African chattel slavery to a place where there is no more African chattel slavery. So he's involved from a very young age. I mean, he's only in his maybe in his early to mid 20s at this point, when he's writing letters to John Adams saying, send me everything that's ever been written on abolitionism. I want to become an expert on this. But he was not I wouldn't say an extremist in the sense that he did not believe in lightning bolt immediate emancipation, right? You don't just declare slavery abolished and set all the slaves free. He never believed this. And his thinking was that if you did that, you would be setting these freedmen or freed people up for failure, because white society had been so relentlessly opposed to the education of slaves. Literacy rates are 0% on purpose. I mean, not zero, but essentially like we are intentionally keeping these people ignorant. They also have no money. They have no capital. They have no, in his mind, skills to be able to go off and be sort of free people in the world. They don't have the education necessary. They don't have the capital necessary. So he believes that the way that this can go is a process of gradual emancipation. He believes that the slaves need to be educated. He believes that they need to be paid wages, even while they are still enslaved, so that when the day comes that they can be emancipated, they can just walk, right out of the legal state of slavery into the legal state of full free personhood and able to go be free persons. So this is his project from the very beginning, and he sticks with this through to the very end. And you can find even speeches from the 1820s when he's in the Chamber of Delegates, and I think maybe even the early 1830s, where he is critical of the Emancipation Decree of 1794. That he doesn't think that was the right way to have gone, which is the National Convention simply declaring every single person, wherever the French flag flies, is a free person now. There is no more slavery. And Lafayette believed that this led to a lot of chaos and misery, both for the free whites and for the now freed Africans. So this is his mentality. And in the days that he is around, of course, this sets him at odds with most of his close personal friends like George Washington and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who agree with him that slavery is morally abhorrent, but also we can't really do anything about it, unfortunately. I mean, we're only the most powerful people in the country, but unfortunately, it's out of our hands. And Lafayette works on them. He's sending them personal letters. He is trying to get them to move, but they're very passive. He is active in terms of wanting to free the slaves and wanting to take this abolitionist route, but he's also going to stand opposed to anybody who says we should just free everybody all at once, which is ultimately like, if slavery is morally abhorrent, in my opinion, to let it go even one day further beyond deciding that the state of slavery is a moral abomination, to even let it go one day further is, in a sense, a moral failing on Lafayette's part, even if he had good reasons in his own mind for believing these things.
So in a way, his vision was a little bit like what happened in the northern states in the United States, in Pennsylvania, in New York, even in Massachusetts. There were processes in which emancipation took place over a period of decades. And that would be kind of the model he had in mind.
Yeah, and it's also very similar to how abolitionism winds up proceeding in Latin America, in Venezuela and Colombia, in Argentina, in Brazil. Those places have this sort of everybody who's born into slavery will be free on their 18th birthday. Things like that go on. That is how emancipation occurs in many places, but in, of course, the United States, the intransigence to this is so complete and so hostile that it did take, the exigencies of war to actually free them with the Thunderbolt.
Yeah. It's very interesting because we can see in retrospect what Lafayette couldn't see in his own life.
Yeah.
That there was going to have to be an upheaval.
Yeah.
But it's always easier for us to see in hindsight than what people can see when they're in the middle of the situation. That's part of what makes him human as well. I wanted to ask you about another issue of rights and relationships. And this has to do with his relationships with women.
Yeah.
You talk in your book about his relation with his wife, his marriage, his relationship with other women, including Fanny Wright and others. How would you describe his view of women and the way he interacted with women in his era?
Well, I will say that before I wrote this book, I read this other book by this guy, Lloyd Kramer, who had an entire chapter in his book about Lafayette's relations with women, which I would say somewhat influenced my own work on this subject.
You must have a brilliant insight on this
Yeah.
issue.
Thank you for Christina Belgioso.
The
she's great.
unknown Christina.
Yeah,
Belgioso.
man, that was great. So I used all that. Yeah, don't worry, you're all over the citations. But Lafayette's relation. So there's two things that go on with him. First, I do think there's something to the fact that he was raised almost entirely by women. With his father dies, and when he is growing up in Chavignac, it is his grandmother and his two aunts, and then he has like a slightly older cousin who becomes basically a surrogate sister. And so his early childhood, and then even when he goes off to Paris and he reunites with his mother is clearly the most important figure in his life for those couple of years that she's still alive in Paris. So he was raised by, influenced by, and was very, very comfortable in the company of women who were not just sort of side pieces or just there for show or there to be seen and not heard. Like, he never, I think, had that relationship with the women in his life. Certainly his marriage with Adrienne was unique in that they liked each other and even loved each other all through these years. And he always relied on her counsel, right? Her advice. I mean, the one piece of advice that she was always trying to give him that he never took was, hey, why don't you stay home and not go back out? He never took that advice. Like, and there's a couple of times where it's like, I don't know, man, maybe you should have listened to Adrienne and stayed home and not joined the French army again. But so all of these things, he listens to women. He's in communication with women. He has his long-term mistress, Madame de Simeon, is, there's a romance to it, but also most of his letters are about sort of day-to-day politics, right? He becomes almost his a political confidant, even more than a romantic liaison. So this is his relationship with women, I think. At the same time, we do not find Lafayette as an aggressive proto-feminist. He's working with, I think, women like Fanny Wright, who are very clearly, not just proto-feminists, but just like outright, feminism now exists as a thing. And for the nods that he will give to the intellectual capacities of women or to the equality of women in terms of their social interactions, you don't really find him aggressively promoting voting rights for women or the Declaration of the Rights of Women, which I think comes from a little bit of the archaic sort of the patriarchal and patrician mentality of he's sort of the father, and the men and the father figures are sort of the benevolent leaders of the family. I think he saw himself in that role, and he was a benevolent father figure. He was a benevolent man in terms of all of this. But was he John Stuart Mill, for example, who's going to come along like a couple years later and write very aggressive tracts in favor of women? I was thinking about this though, because I knew we were going to talk about it. And I do wonder, like, if you shifted Lafayette a little bit and aligned his life more with somebody like John Stuart Mill, and if Lafayette had the chance to read a fully mature John Stuart Mill when it comes to like the vindication of the rights of women, I think that he has it in him to become those things and to see and to finally realize, oh, right, of course, like we're all equal. But I don't think he got there in his own lifetime, at least not in any sort of major way.
I think he wasn't really an advocate for voting rights, but he did advocate for rights of divorce. I remember at the very end of his life, he tried to help Maria Malibran, the opera singer, to gain a divorce from a miserable husband. He had a certain sympathy for women who were caught in those situations. I want to shift the gears just a little bit and connect something with your past work on the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic. And the people of the Revolutionary era were very aware of ancient Roman history. And I wonder if you could say something about how Lafayette viewed the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, And is there anybody in the Roman Empire or Republic to whom you would compare Lafayette? You have
Yeah.
studied that republic and empire more than anybody I know, almost. And yet, where does Lafayette connect with that history?
Yeah, and this was actually one of the great things, having spent so much time in ancient Rome, and particularly with the Republicans, the old Roman Republicans, gave me a very nice insight into that French Revolutionary generation, because those guys, Desmoulins, Robespierre, Danton, Mirabeau, I mean, these guys were steeped in the classics, right? They read so much Plutarch, they read so much Livy, they read so much Polybius, they were steeped in this stuff and believed that they were in essence recreating the Roman Republic. That's what they were trying to do. And there's all these things like, is the United States the new Rome? Are we the Roman Republic? And those guys who were running around in 1789, 1790, they thought they were the new Rome. This is where you get neoclassical architecture and neoclassical art is coming into the fold at the same time. So all of them were busy casting themselves. Oh, I get to be Cicero, and you'll be Cato, and you be Brutus, and we'll go kill Caesar, who I guess is now a woman and an Austrian named Marie Antoinette. So that's who they saw themselves as, and they were taught all this in school, which is one of the great ironies of history. Is this absolutist regime, the curriculum is just, here's a bunch of Athenian democratic and Roman Republican heroes for you to all emulate. And Lafayette had this very peculiar relationship with all of this, is that for all of those figures, there's a really nice quote. And when I landed on, I was like, oh, this is beautiful. This is absolutely going in the book. Is he said that he would rather be Vercingetorix, defending, the hills of provincial Auvergne. And Vercingetorix was the last Gallic leader, the one who organized the last resistance of the Gauls to the conquest of Caesar during the Gallic Wars, which a lot of this is taking place in Auvergne, which is Lafayette's backyard. The Battle of Gergovia, which is one of Caesar's great defeats in the Gallic Wars, happened proverbially just down the road from where Lafayette grew up. So he didn't see himself as Cato. He didn't see himself as Brutus. He didn't really even see himself necessarily as a Roman. He identified with the resistance to Roman encroachment and to Roman Empire. He saw himself, I think, as a freedom fighter. And you can see a lot, especially in his later life, when he goes off to have these adventures, in the American Revolution, these guys are trying to break away from an empire. That's Vercingetorix. That spirit of resistance to the Roman Empire is a part of him. And then this extends all the way, 50, 60 years later, when he's talking to Polish revolutionaries, Greek revolutionaries, Italian revolutionaries, Spanish revolutionaries, and encouraging national self-determination and national liberation. All of this stuff is present in any story about Vercingetorix, which I think is where Lafayette situated himself in that old classical milieu.
So what he took from the history of the Roman Empire was to fight empires.
Yeah.
He was an anti-imperialist.
I think he was.
He liked smashing imperial powers. And another issue I wanted to raise, which I think has to do with our own time. He lived through these incredibly polarized cultures in the French Revolution, when he visited America in 1824 in the John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson presidential race, in the Revolution of 1830. He was caught up in extremely bitter, polarized political cultures, as we are today. And I wonder what you think his experiences might say to us about how to deal with radical polarization. And the problem of the center. I guess that would be my other question.
Yeah. So Lafayette does wind up being seen, just because of the times that he lived in, as like a centrist, or somebody who was a moderate, who stood aloof to extremes on both sides. And but he has these two different experiences where this role that he's playing in the United States, when he comes back, it's followers of John Quincy Adams are ready to kill the followers of Jackson, and Jackson's people are ready to rise up and revolt if Jackson loses the election. But every time Lafayette comes through, everybody sort of puts down their guns and puts down their knives and puts down their poison pens, and join together in celebrating him. Whereas in France, the same kind of polarizing milieu, he couldn't escape that. He did get dragged into it, and he did ultimately have a factional position inside of French politics in a way that he always tried to stay aloof from factional politics in the United States.
Mhm.
But I don't think, and I think that Lafayette will back me up on this, like if we can resurrect him and ask him.
Well, I'd love to do that.
Maybe we can do this.
That's your next project.
Yeah. So I don't think that he was a centrist in a meaningful sense of that term. And there was this other quote, because I think centrism is a lot about looking at whatever the two sort of extremes of politics are, or at least the extremes of what is acceptable politics, and then saying, I should occupy a place in the center of this. That's the place to be, like neither too far to the left nor too far to the right. I have to be in the middle. And there's this great quote when he's ragging on Francois Guizot, who was prime minister, essentially prime minister after the July Revolution, and Lafayette has wound up sort of opposed to Francois Guizot. And Guizot's whole program was this thing called the juste milieu, which is whatever the two sides are, we will aim for something right down the middle, and we will call that good policy. And Lafayette gave this speech where he goes, this policy of just milieu is crazy. If one person says 4 + 4 is 8, and another person says 4 + 4 is 10, would you say that now, okay, the proper answer is 4 + 4 is 9, right? Mm-hmm. That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. So he was somebody who did have values that he stuck with and believed in. And whichever sort of way the winds were shifting, sometimes we find him on the far left of politics, and sometimes we find him on the far right of politics, and sometimes we find him right in the middle of politics. Mm-hmm. But he was not somebody who was just trying to live in the center. And if people were going too far in one direction for him, he wasn't going to follow in that direction simply because that's where the center was moving. And there are these quotes from both. There's one from Jefferson and from John Adams. I forget which one said this particular one, which is early in Lafayette's life, before the French Revolution. They're commenting on him and saying, like, he's panting for glory. He's panting for fame. Like he has this almost canine.
Yes.
Yeah, he has a canine appetite for fame. And they were really concerned about what would happen if sort of Lafayette's craving for popularity, which was real, ran up against the mob or the people wanting to hear something different than what Lafayette was selling. Would he abandon his principles and then go chase the crowd, or go chase whatever was happening in that moment? And the answer, and so this gets thrown at him as sort of like a dig, like, oh, here's Lafayette, he just chases like whoever's popular. But that's not what he did. When the French Revolution turned and suddenly the people wanted to hear different things from him, he just kept saying the same things. He's going into the well, basically, of the Jacobin Club and telling them to their faces, you guys are the problem, even though they now basically run France. So he lives in these extreme worlds, but he was never trying to just live in the center, because ultimately, if you live just in the center and follow that around and try to live there, you ultimately don't really have values yourself. You're just waiting for other people to have two extreme values and then saying, well, I must be virtuous and noble because I'm in between these things. That was never a place that Lafayette took himself, and not any place he ever would have been, because the guy had real principles that he believed in.
And that is a really important point. We can't, sometimes people fall into this both sidism kind of view, like in journalism. Well, some people say the climate's getting warmer and some people say it's not. I guess I'm sort of in the middle, and some people say the Holocaust took place and other people say it didn't. No, you've got to say it happened or it didn't.
Some people say the election was legitimate. Some people say it was a giant theft and fraud. Let's hear from both sides.
Yeah.
So in the middle of all of this, when I come across a speech from Lafayette saying if one person says 4 + 4 is 8 and another person says 4 + 4 is 10, the right answer is not 4 + 4 is 9, because there is truth in this world, and 4 + 4 is 8. And I certainly did put that in the book.
Facts are very stubborn, and
Yep.
the facts must be acknowledged.
Yeah.
Which leads me to one of my last questions. You've written about revolutions, and Lafayette was a key figure in what's often been called the Age of Revolution, as you call it. R.R. Palmer wrote the book called The Age of the Democratic Revolutions.
Mhm.
But many people see right now that democratic institutions and traditions are under a consistent attack, not only in the United States, but around the world. So I wonder, at this moment, what do you think we can learn from Lafayette about the struggle to defend democracy? Do you think he was an advocate of democracy? And if so, what could he bring to the table for us? Let's say a usable Lafayette in a time when people might reject the outcome of democratic elections.
Yeah, I think that the word you used is struggle. And I think that that is a good word to use for these things. And what impresses me about Lafayette, because we often do wind up talking about the things that he gets wrong. A thing that he got very right for his entire life is that action is required to do things. There is no abstract force of history or force of progress that is simply going to achieve the things that we want to see achieved in this world. There is no abstract principle of American democracy that is self-defending, right? It is not there's not some metaphysical force that will defend these institutions. And if anybody tries to, upend an election or overturn the Constitution, it will simply be impossible due to this spiritual, whatever it is, some godlike entity that just takes care of things for us. None of that is true. And Lafayette understood that to achieve these things took real action. You actually had to do things. When he wanted to see better rights for Protestants, he is meeting with those leaders. He's trying to organize those leaders. He's writing petitions to the king. He's giving people money. When he gets into abolitionism, he's not like his friends Washington and Madison and Jefferson, who were like, well, ultimately this will all just work itself out. No, Lafayette is going to devote his time, his effort, his attention, ultimately, sacrificing a great chunk of his fortune trying to see these things through. And he's doing this his whole life. One of my favorite things is that one of the very last letters that's in his collection of, the family papers that are published right after his death, like the last one is to an abolitionist society in Scotland. And it opens with him complaining that he's got this chest cold that he can't shake. And he's supposed to be giving a speech in the Chamber of Deputies, but he can't make it down there. He's not a passive guy. And if Lafayette was here, I don't think that he would say, oh, don't worry about it, things will work themselves out. He would say, yo, I've seen this before and it does not end well. I think we should do something about it.
And he might go to Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. And, I don't want to do the thing where I draft, the subject of my book to voice my own concerns or my own things. But I really do think that Lafayette would have looked at the last 5 years and seen very familiar elements at work in modern American politics, as he saw, especially during the French Revolutionary era, that he would have said, you can't just let this go on. You have to actually forcefully defend it. And so that's I think a good lesson to learn. And it gets back to sort of this, his critique of centrism. You have to stand for things. And when things that you believe in and things that are true are being attacked, you have to fight back and you have to take action. Otherwise you'll lose without having done anything.
So that leads to my very last question. If you could imagine your ideal reader of your book, what would you want that person to most take away from reading your book?
My ideal reader, first of all, will buy 30 to 35 copies of The Hero of Two Worlds and give it to all their friends and relatives. No, I think, calling back to sort of what we were talking about at the very beginning, is that there is this business where in American history, and Americans have a tendency to overrate Lafayette a little bit. And I think that in French history and French historians have a tendency to really underrate Lafayette quite a bit, right?
Mhm.
He's lost a lot. His historical memory is not great for Lafayette in France at the moment. But I think what I would want people to take away from this is a unified picture of a single human being who was
Mhm.
trying to do all the things that he was trying to accomplish. And sometimes he succeeded and sometimes he failed, but he was the same single person. He never changed. He didn't become a different person when he moved from America to France. Not everything he did in America was perfect, nor was everything he did in France a failure. He had a lot of success in France. When he died, Chateaubriand is saying this, not his supporters. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out to be there for his funeral. Louis Philippe was afraid that Lafayette's funeral was going to turn into another revolt, just as it had with General Lamarck in 1832. He was incredibly popular. He was a very influential figure. But I think like the last thing I'll say about this is that when I walked into this, people said, is this a great man biography? Are you writing a great man biography? And I think that ultimately, I don't think that I wrote a great man biography, but I do believe that I wrote a good man biography. I do think that he was a good guy who used his position, his influence, his power, his wealth to try to improve the world that he saw around him. He was always trying to reform things. If he heard about some injustice, he tried to get in there to fix it, whether it was individual people, later in life, he's helping liberal refugees, or whether it's these really huge issues where he wants to renew the entire Kingdom of France to just make it a better place. He's not Napoleon. He's not Robespierre. He's not one of these great figures, because you kind of have to be a bit of a monster to be Napoleon, to be Julius Caesar. And the Marquis de Lafayette was not a monster. He was a good guy who was trying to do good things. And he, I think, mostly succeeded. And that's what I would want people to take away from the book, I think, in the end.
Yeah, I like that. He was a human being who did good things, who made mistakes. And in the end, he provides a model for what it means to be a human being in difficult situations.
Yeah.
So we're going to turn now to the next phase of our discussion. And I'm going to ask Chuck to come in. He's been monitoring some questions.
Yep.
And I had thought about showing a few images, which I think I might do at the very end, some images of some of the places and people we've talked about. But let's go right into the questions. So Chuck, why don't you start with one, and I will also look for some.
Thank you, Lloyd. My first question was actually emailed earlier this week, and it's actually a question I'm very interested in. It comes from Jada, and she's a first-year member of the American Friends of Lafayette. And Jada says she was wondering if I could ask Mr. Duncan if he knows about Nicholas de Prost and David Franzoni's possible development of a Lafayette series, because Mr. Duncan was given an interview recently about the different media depictions of Lafayette. And I know all of us at the American Friends of Lafayette are anxious to see a mini series or a movie or something special about Lafayette in the very near future. So could you help us with that, Mike?
Okay, so I had never heard of this, but I did get this. We got this one in advance, and I looked into it. And here's the thing. I found basically one article from Variety about this that is then what is either repurposed or linked to or referenced. It's like October of 2020. Even the IMDb page for this project simply links to this same thing, which is like these two French guys are taking maybe going to develop a Lafayette miniseries, and they had taken it to some like conference to try to get this thing off the ground. So far as I can tell, I cannot find anything else about it. Okay. So if it exists, it is in development somewhere. If it doesn't exist, then it doesn't exist. What I will say is that I have my own ambitions about what to do with these various stories. And I will be shopping this book as much and as hard as I can with the various contacts that I have in Tinseltown to try to turn Lafayette in some way, shape, or form into a TV show, whether it is a prestige HBO drama series or whether it is a very funny Versailles 90210 comedy series about Lafayette as a teenager at Versailles. It will be something. I'm going to try to get it done.
That would be great, Mike. Thank you very much. Lloyd, did you find a question you want to ask?
Yeah, that's great. I think we can then call him a hero of three worlds if he lands in Hollywood. Why
That's
not?
right.
So here's a question from Catherine, who says, Lafayette had an incredible life, but can you talk about the enemies he made along the way? Why did people not like Lafayette?
Oh,
Can you say a little
Lafayette
more about
enemies? Oh, Lafayette didn't have any enemies.
that? Except that he had to run for his life.
Except he had to run away from a death warrant. Yeah, Lafayette made enemies in two ways, and this is how he winds up being ultimately, I think, kind of forgotten in French historiography. Who are his enemies? Marie Antoinette ultimately becomes an enemy, right? People inside the Comte d'Artois, right, who is his old classmate at Versailles 90210, is also going to wind up being his enemy, because they see Lafayette as the leading edge of a movement to, at a minimum, put the Bourbon monarchy, the ancient Bourbon monarchy, the divinely appointed leaders of the Kingdom of France, into a box and control them, and to not let them wield the power that had been divinely given to them by God. And then at a maximum to help overthrow that monarchy, even as Lafayette is saying, like, I don't want to overthrow the monarchy, I'm loyal. So he becomes a hated figure inside ultra royalist camps who believe that this is what he's doing. And then even later in his life, there's a great quote from Louis XVIII, who was the Comte de Provence, who, him and Lafayette also go back 40 years to Lafayette insulting him as a teenager. Where Lafayette's about to be elected to the Chamber of Deputies, and Louis XVIII is like, that animal Lafayette, it's incomprehensible. So he has all of those enemies coming out of the royal family, but at the same time, like, his ideals don't take him to a position of actually wanting to overthrow the monarchy, actually creating a republic, which sets him at odds with people like Danton and Desmoulins and Robespierre, who see him now not as somebody who is trying to overthrow the monarchy, but somebody who is trying, against the will of the people, to keep this unjust, parasitic institution in place that is, sapping the lifeblood of the people of France. And why is Lafayette who is in league with Marie Antoinette? He wasn't in league with Marie Antoinette. She hated him. But they certainly thought that he was in league with Marie Antoinette. And so in the popular presses, people like Marat, Desmoulins, Robespierre, Danton are all going to assail him because he's trying to stop the revolution from moving in a more radical direction. And this is where, this is how he gets popped out, the wrong side of the revolution, because he ultimately doesn't really have supporters anywhere. He's surrounded by enemies by 1791, 1792, and has very few friends left, except Adrienne, who's saying things like, hey, why don't you just stay home and not go out again?
Okay.
All right, I have a comment and a question for you, please. The comment is from Mr. Villard, who says, I'm actively developing a mini-series with Academy Award nominee Nicholas Myers. So somebody's out there doing something for us. There you go. 2 thumbs up, Nicholas, Dimitri. And then Ben Goldman would like to know,
hit me up.
How would you compare Lafayette's leadership style with the main cast Prime Universe Starfleet captains?
Wait, what?
Yep.
Run that by me again.
How would you compare Lafayette's leadership style with the main cast Prime Universe Starfleet captains?
With the mainline Starfleet captains. Okay, good thing I'm a Trekkie. So I can kind of answer this, right? He's not as stoic and reserved as Picard, right? And he certainly doesn't have, like, Lafayette, when he would look at George Washington had this like stoic ability to walk into a room and command respect. And Lafayette was really impressed by this. And I don't think that Lafayette ever had this same effect on people that he wanted. Now, Jean-Luc Picard has this effect on people. He can walk into, or, the doors open and he can just walk through them. And he is able to command that respect. So I would see Lafayette really maybe being a good first officer for Jean-Luc Picard. It is worth noting that Ben Sisko's middle name is Lafayette. He was because he's from New Orleans, so probably named after the street that's named after Lafayette. But Lafayette or Cisco was a bit more of a loose cannon. Kirk was more of a loose cannon, although that I think Kirk was willing to do things that maybe Lafayette was not willing to do. But let's just make Lafayette the first officer to Picard, and just
Thank you very much.
Have that be a good spot for him.
I know it was not a normal question and probably over many people's heads here, but I thought it should be asked.
Well, it's something I can talk about in great detail. I have decided to stop talking about it so that I don't talk about it for the next 30 minutes.
You should know that the gentleman that asked the question is quite the interpreter of Lafayette. He plays Lafayette for us quite often, and
awesome.
Has actually played Lafayette at the White House. So, yes.
So
I know that guy.
Mike, I wanted to ask you a question that's come in from Hank Cohen, who says, without diminishing the role of Lafayette in the American Revolution, don't you think that Rochambeau's military intervention was far more significant than Lafayette's?
Oh, sure. My thesis when it comes to Lafayette's participation in the American Revolution is not that, actually Lafayette is the secret reason why we won the war. I'm not even sure it would be fair to say that Lafayette is the reason that the French joined the war in the first place. I think that absent Lafayette, larger structural political realities in terms of like the way that France and the colonial rebels were moving towards each other, I think happens maybe even absent Lafayette. So, even more, what is even more important than Rochambeau's expedition is the French Navy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you were going to list the reasons we won that war, especially when it comes to France's participation, it's the French Navy is number one, Rochambeau's expedition, and especially their military engineers who help, solve Yorktown. So Lafayette's role in all of this is to be the mediator between these two sides. And I do think that there were multiple points during the alliance, both at let's say in Newport, Rhode Island, and both everything kind of the various debacles that went on down in Georgia. There were plenty of opportunities for both the Americans and the French to say, you know what, this just isn't worth it. For the Americans to say, you know what, just stay over there. Like we were doing fine without you and we'll win the war without you. And for the French to say, you know what, this is all just like maybe cost too much, which, just between us, it probably did. Maybe they should not have spent all that money trying to help us break away from Britain. Like I would not have necessarily recommended they do that. But Lafayette has the confidence of George Washington. He has the confidence of Henry Lawrence, right, who was for a long time the president of the Second Continental Congress. He has the confidence of the Comte de Vergennes. He has the confidence of Benjamin Franklin. He has the confidence literally of the King and Queen of France at that point, right? He knows them on a personal level. And I think that he was able to sort of keep everybody on the same page and keep everybody together in a positive way by saying good things about the Americans to the French and saying good things about the French to the Americans. If you pull him out of that, does everything unfold the way that it does? Like maybe yes, maybe no. I certainly though think that it happens a lot smoother because Lafayette is in the middle of it, actively playing this role.
It looks like we could use him today because the Navy is once again at the center of the problem. Right. And if we could send him to Australia, maybe he could sort things out,
Yeah, he's Lafayette. Like I don't say Lafayette is definitely writing angry letters to his American friends, being like, "What are you doing? We had a deal with these guys." Like he was a French patriot. He wasn't completely Americanized. He always stood up for French honor with the Americans. I think there's many angry letters that he's writing right now.
He would be writing a lot of letters this week.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure everybody's patient because we have over 40 questions. There's no way we're going to get to all these tonight, but I have one from Jay from Lafayette, Colorado, and he asks, what would you think about Lafayette? No, I'm sorry. What would Lafayette think about the final outcome of James Armistead? What would Lafayette think of the final outcome of James Armistead?
The final outcome of James Armistead being his ultimate emancipation? Or what happens to him further down the line?
I would guess, if I had to guess, he's asking further down the line.
If it's further down the line, I will have to confess ignorance as to the final and ultimate fate of James Armistead Lafayette.
Okay.
If it is about his fate in terms of it taking 2 years to get him emancipated, despite his heroic wartime service, Lafayette was quite displeased about all that and would have freed him on the spot as well. He should have been freed on the spot.
Thank you.
So,
Lloyd?
I think
Lloyd,
he
Lloyd, do you
actually
know?
saw Armistead when he came back in 1824. Is that correct? Does someone know for sure? I believe. I think
Okay.
Alan's raising his hand. Yes.
There we go.
So there was another encounter in the 1820s. Yeah. I actually have another question also from Jay about the election in 1824. Given the fact that Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, it was overturned in the House of Representatives. What do you think? This is Jay's question. We can't know, but what would he think of today's presidential claim for the big lie and the political environment in which we're living? If we could bring him back today, what would his reaction be to Lafayette Square events and other recent conflicts? Well, that's a huge question. But what do you know what he thought about 1824, or you know how that election was resolved?
Well, I think that there is a degree, like, number one, it's hard to tell because he was so purposefully trying to stay aloof to all of it, and was quite successful in this. You know, he walks out of that election still friendly with Andrew Jackson, still friendly with John Quincy Adams, still friendly with William Crawford, and still friendly with Henry Clay, who were the 4 people who were involved in that election. So he was trying to stay aloof to it. Lafayette is can become a bit of a constitutional proceduralist when it comes to once the Constitution and the rules are in place, you have to follow the rules as they are written, right? We came together as a group, you know, and then in terms of leaders getting together in constitutional convention, ratifying this document, having this be our Constitution. There are rules in place for how we run this election. So now we have this question. Nobody won the popular vote. Okay, number one, doesn't matter to Lafayette because that's not at issue. You know, that's not the rules of the game as written in the Constitution, which is true to this very day. Claims to winning the popular vote have I believe, a great deal of moral authority. But ultimately, it is, according to the Constitution, the Electoral College that matters. So when nobody achieved a majority of Electoral College votes, what does the Constitution say to do? It says, kick it over to the House of Representatives and they shall decide it. And here we have an assembly of the representatives of the nation who are going to vote according to these rules. And it went through many, many ballots, and there was a great deal of horse trading and a great deal of threats and accusations on both sides. Ultimately, Clay's electors throw their support to John Quincy Adams to make sure that Andrew Jackson doesn't become president. I think if Lafayette's sitting there watching this, I don't have a diary. I don't think we have a diary of him doing a play-by-play on this, but all of this goes according to the rules. And so he's quite satisfied with the outcome, even as the Jacksonians walk out of this very angry, because they do believe that their man did have the popular mandate that was betrayed by the corrupt bargain, right? This is where the corrupt, because John Quincy Adams turns around and makes Clay Secretary of State after getting his votes. But I think for Lafayette, he would be cool with all of that. Now, if you fast forward to today, and we're looking at a mob of people trying to overturn a process that leads to a mob of people trying to overturn the peaceful transfer of power from one political party to the other, which is completely outside the rules. I think he is aghast. I think he's trying to stop this. I think he's recommending to everybody who will listen to him that we need to do something to prevent these people from overturning the Constitution. And then but that's only the end of the story. I think from the very beginning, Lafayette had a great deal of experience with manipulated elections. He spent most of his time under the restored Bourbon dynasty trying to get elected and stay in the Chamber of Delegates, and being the victim of what I would say was real electoral fraud. His voters being purged from the rolls, threats being issued by the government. Again, if you vote for Lafayette, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. There was one point where they tried to say that he didn't qualify. He didn't have the property requirement to qualify to stand because most of his property was actually in the names of his wife and the names of his children. So he was very actually familiar with what a state can do to manipulate an election. And I just think that he would have looked at everything that happened in November and December and January and been like, there's nothing here, like there are procedures for this too. Every time you go before a court of law, for your claims to be proven true, to establish, yes, they manipulated the election. Yes, there are fraudulent votes. When the rubber met the road in the courtroom, they were like, well, we actually don't have anything. We just kind of don't want our guy to have lost. I don't think that's going to fly with Lafayette. And again, I don't want to put words into his mouth because obviously I have an opinion about this. But I don't think that he would have recognized any of this as legitimate fraud, especially not himself having been the victim for many, many years of actual, real, legitimate electoral fraud.
Well, there's no question that the attack on the Capitol would have evoked for him the memory of what happened in Paris in the National Convention when the crowds just came in and took over.
Sure. And I mean,
that's essentially what drove him out of France.
And there's a moment in 1830 where, there was, Louis Philippe is going to be king now. And the Orleanists are huddling in a room to rewrite the charter of government, to revise it and reform it. And there was a mob that went down to, I think it was the Palais de Bourbon where they were meeting. I forget which of the several buildings it was, where there was a mob of people who were going to go down to disrupt all of this. And Lafayette strode out in front of them because most of them were his supporters. And he said, no, this is not the way. Please go home. If you do this, you will dishonor me. If you like me, you will turn around and leave. And they did.
Yeah. Okay. Chuck, I'll throw it over to you.
And you answered about 6 questions with that one, because a lot of people are asking about the political climate and how it compares and whatnot. So I'm going to ask a question that more than one person also asked, and that's about the Haitian Revolution. Did Lafayette write about the Haitian Revolution? What was his opinion of it? Did he correspond with any of the revolutionaries? Could you expand on that for us, please, Mike?
Sure. Lafayette's relationship with the Haitian Revolution is the same kind of mixed bag, I think, that is his relationship with most of abolitionism and slavery. In that, as I said earlier, Lafayette is not somebody who believes that thunderbolt from the sky emancipation is a good idea. He wants things to proceed steadily, slowly. He wants it to come through education and through people getting wages, people being able to buy their own property, people being able to buy themselves out of slavery is a good way to do it. Pay them wages until they've earned out how much they cost as human beings. Sometimes it's like, God, man, don't say that. But so when he looked at Saint-Domingue and he looked at the Haitian Revolution, he did not see something that represented his ideal mode of emancipation. And he used it, and a lot of what happened in the Caribbean up to and after 1794, the Emancipation Decree, as proof later in life that gradual emancipation was the way to go. Because if you just do it all at once, you're going to get chaos, you're going to get revolution, you're going to get bloodshed. And he could point to the Haitian Revolution and make that point. At the same time, when Saint-Domingue, when the people of Saint-Domingue freed themselves from slavery and declared themselves independent, first there was a kingdom and there was a republic in the South. Lafayette corresponded, especially with the presidents of Free Haiti in the South, and he was very supportive of what they were doing. He was supportive of independence. He was very much in favor of France recognizing the independence of Haiti without what were the demands at the time, which is this indemnity. That is still ongoing today. Like if you know anything about Haiti, you know that one of the big things that happened is that France laid this huge indemnity down as the price of recognition. Right. And it was the people of Haiti paying France back for having liberated themselves from slavery. And now I will get on my high horse a little bit here and say that Macron needs to write the Haitians a check like tomorrow, maybe even today. I don't know how late it is in France, but he needs to write that check like now, like he should pay them back. But Lafayette was in favor of not having laid down that indemnity.
Right.
And being a known abolitionist and being a known and being somebody who I think, as I said earlier too, legitimately didn't see racial inequality as being some inherent natural thing that Africans were somehow less than. You never find him talking about how, oh, they can't rule themselves or they need somebody to govern them and look at the mess they're making. It was never anything like that. And so again, you find him, I think, on the right side of that issue in many ways. But at the same time, I think if you asked him point blank, do you think the Haitian Revolution was a good thing or proceeded the way that you would have wanted it to? I think he would have said, no, that's not actually the way.
Thank you very much, Mike.
He certainly condemned Napoleon's policies in Haiti, though.
100%.
He
Yes.
was totally opposed to that. I wanted to share a question from Hank Parfit. Hank is one of our active Lafayette friends in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the first city named for Lafayette. And Hank writes, Lafayette was very busy from 1789 to 92 as commander of the National Guard, putting out fires, rescuing people, etc. Would he have been better off at some point letting his second in command handle the policing of Paris and devoting himself to building a true constitutional republic? In other words, was he trying to do too much? And could he have had a better outcome if he had focused on politics rather than the National Guard?
Yeah, he was trying to do too much. I think it was observed by his friends and acquaintances, especially by 1790, that too much was running through him. Governor Morris has a good quote about it. You know, he's trying to be everything simultaneously. And I think that there's a couple of things at play here. One of which is Lafayette is himself such a uniquely famous person, and such a uniquely sort of, his name means something, his image means something. He has a cachet amongst the people of Paris that when he shows up, he can influence events. If he simply sends his second in command, you know, whoever, you know, Pierre, I don't know, I'll make up a French name, I forget who his second in command is. But if you send that guy out there, the people are just going to pelt him with cobblestones and yell at him and throw dung and stuff, or maybe take some shots at him. So I do believe that Lafayette felt like he personally needed to be the hero on the white horse who rides out there and is personally able to calm things down. Like, I'm Lafayette, that's what I'm here for. What that means, though, is that that's the role that he needs to be playing. And if his political project is going to get solidified, if this constitutional monarchy, these Declaration of Rights, opposing both ultra conservatives who want to take things back to the way they were before 1789, and these radical Jacobins who he dislikes now for a number of different reasons, that means that he needs better political allies to handle the political side of things. And I think there is a thing where Mirabeau is trying to get Lafayette to do this, like, we'll tag team this thing. Like, I'll do the politics, you do the National Guard, and we'll see this thing through to the end. And Lafayette remained aloof from Mirabeau. And I don't know that alliance would have worked. I mean, obviously Mirabeau is such an incredibly, complicated and compromised figure himself that I don't know if that's like the silver bullet answer. But I think that really, when it comes to, like, what should Lafayette have done? I think he was he was serving a very positive role in being the man responsible for maintaining order. He should not have gone off, and he should not have left that behind to go do politics. He should have made alliances with better politicians, basically. Maybe it was Mirabeau.
So he was the guy who was trying to keep people from invading the capital so that the people in the capital could do what they were supposed to do.
Yeah. And Lafayette was always a better soldier than he was politician, I think. I think that's fair.
Chuck, I have another question, but do you have one as well?
I have one. Here you go. Most of Lafayette's Paris is gone now, but did being able to follow in his footsteps help the book come together, or has Paris's transformations made that harder?
No, being in Paris was amazing. I'll be 85, 90, 100 years old. I don't know. Maybe they'll come out with pills that keep me alive to be 150. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter how old I get. Being able to live in Paris for 3 years to write this book was an incredible experience that I think I think I could have written a good book from wherever I was living in the United States. And I think I was able to write a much better book because I went to these places. And yes, Baron Ostman, cleared everything out, and it does look different and it does feel different than it would have in his day. But at the same time, I could take my laptop over to the Tuileries Garden and I could sit there in the Tuileries Garden and write.
It's amazing.
And I lived in the Marais, and I lived not too far from the Hotel de Ville, and I edited a lot of the book, and edited especially anytime that I was writing a section of the book that took place in a certain place in Paris. I would go there, I would grab a chair, I would sit on the ground, I would sit in a cafe, and I would inhabit that space where it is different, right? But ultimately the space is the same. And like I would get on the bus and I'd be like, oh yeah, man, those lampposts right over there. That's where they hung Fouillon and Berthier, right? Like there it is, And there were also a couple of times, I was also living there. These 3 years that I was there for France, winning the World Cup. So I was there in Paris when they won the World Cup, which was an insane load of
The Champs-Élysées, that was nuts. Right?
Oh my God, it was insane, right? This is right after we first got there. So I've seen just like exultant, patriotic, triumphant Parisians just parading through the streets, singing, hugging each other, crying, like guzzling wine, guzzling beer. But at the same time, I was also there for all the Gilets jaunes stuff, the yellow vests, which were every Saturday there were civil disturbances, and 3 or 4 of them you would call outright riots. There was burning, there were gunshots, things were on fire. I was also there for the largest transit strike in a generation, which I saw literally hundreds of thousands of people march. This is right before COVID. The transportation strike rolled right into COVID. So like people say, oh, well, what was it like when Paris shut down? I was like, well, Paris had kind of been shut down for about 4 months before COVID even happened because of the transit strike. So all of those things, like even though the buildings were a little bit different, like I do feel like the book and the action, especially the stuff that's going on in Paris, is very much informed by my own lived experience, which I just considered to be a huge blessing. I don't know how else to say it.
Mike, did you make it down to Auvergne?
I did. Yeah.
Good.
We spent a week in Auvergne. My car broke down in the middle of a blizzard, and I actually spent 3 days stranded outside of Auvergne in a very small hotel, and taken care of by a lovely old couple who had no other visitors because of the giant freak blizzard that had just come through.
I think you should write a book on how you wrote the book.
Yeah, man.
Well, I think you've made a good case for how Zoom can never quite replace experiential learning.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I love going to the places.
I know. That's why we've got to bring you around to bookstores and not just do all this on Zoom.
I know.
So I have one more question here about his relationships with women. Graham Brent writes, you talked a little about Lafayette's relationship with women and how much he depended on his confidante, Madame de Simeon. Perhaps he had other mistresses too. Did he depend on Adrienne also for advice and counsel? And I will add this question, what did Adrienne think about his affairs with other women? Do you know?
Well, to take the last one first, I think to the extent that we have a window into Adrienne's own thinking about these things comes from the biography that their daughter wrote later on. And I think it's very clear that the affairs hurt her feelings. I don't think there's any reason to doubt that they hurt her feelings. There's this thing where back in the day, especially among the French aristocracy, it's like, and people say this about the French today. And I also got to live there for 3 years, and I met a lot of women who were married to Frenchmen. And, there's this like, oh, well, of course I have affairs, like I have my wife and that's my family. But it's expected that I carry on affairs with other women. And Lafayette did this, I think, partly because that's who he was. He had multiple affairs over the course of his marriage, but also because that's what somebody in his social position was expected to do. If he had not been carrying on an affair, it would have turned him into quite a weird pariah in a certain sense. But for as much as it is quote unquote expected, to have your husband off sleeping with other women is a hurtful thing. And I think that he did hurt her in those ways. And I think that even today, like I do really actually believe that there's a misconception about the way that French romance works, that like all French wives are just totally cool with their husbands cheating on them all the time. And this is not anything that I have experienced to be true. And it's why the French men hide it from their wives all the time. Yeah, they're not open about it. They actually keep it quite hidden. And they do it on purpose because I do think it's hurtful. So I think that in that her experience, and she never, so far as I can tell, she never took a lover in like on her side. She remained faithful to him the entire time. What was the first question? I now forgot.
Just whether he depended on Adrienne for the kind of confidence he did with Madame de Sémillon on politics and public issues.
Yeah, it's a weird thing in that a lot of his letters to Simeon do go into a great deal of political detail in a way that his letters and sort of the relationship that he had with Adrienne did not. In that they were together involved in these things as a couple when it comes to Protestant toleration, or it comes to even later like protecting Catholic priests who are not going to swear the civic oath, when it comes to poor relief, when it comes to doing good works in Auvergne. Like they were together on these things. When they bought the plantation in Cayenne as their experiment in emancipation, Adrienne was the one who did really most of the practical work keeping that going. So I don't know that she served as sort of like a consigliere in terms of like giving him really cunning and good sly advice about how to maneuver things politically. But they were very much like a team on the projects that they were trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you. I think we're coming up toward the end. Chuck, do you have any final comments or suggestions?
I just want to thank you, Lloyd. I can't thank you enough for helping us with this today. President Hoffman, thank you very much for being here today and doing such a wonderful job. But most of all, Mike, I'm reading your book as we speak. I'm mesmerized by it, pun intended. And
I never did talk about the mesmerism, did I?
But it's just fantastic work. And thank you very, very much. Everybody, if you haven't bought the book, buy the book. I'm enjoying listening to the book. Mike narrates the book. It's done wonderfully. Hear him tell it has been just a real joy for me. So it's one of the most extraordinary books about Lafayette I've ever read since Lloyd's. So
of course, since Lloyd, number two.
We got a couple of big hitters here, that's for sure. Mike has a lot more to bring Lafayette to prominence.
And I
Mike,
want to
let me just ask Mike if he has any final thoughts. I mean, about conversations about Lafayette.
I will just say that, we talked about this a little bit on the phone the other day, that here you are, you've been working with you've done other things in your life, other things in your career. And yet there's something about Lafayette that you just kind of keep getting drawn back into having these conversations about this guy. And I have been living with him for probably 5 years now, 6 years. Wrote this whole book. I've done a ton of interviews. I've been on TV talking about it. I've been here talking about it. And I'm really not sick of him. I'm not over it,
Neither are we.
Yeah, man. I'm still eager and excited. And I think that as the years go by, like whatever else I do with my career, there will be times where it's like, okay, somebody's asking for me to come talk about Lafayette, and I'll be there. I just don't really see myself ever getting to the point where he's not somebody that I'm interested in talking about. In that sense, I've got the bug that everybody's in here got, and I think that's just going to keep going.
It's easy to get in a relationship with Lafayette, but it's very hard to get out of a relationship.
I don't think I'm getting out of this. Yeah.
I've never managed to fully escape, and I don't mind it at all.
Well, I really appreciate you getting dragged back into this for me.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Alan. And thank you to everybody who's been part of this conversation.
And thank you, Carolina Public Humanities and the American Friends of Lafayette. If you'd like to learn more about the American Friends of Lafayette, please go to www.friendsoflafayette.org. friendsoflafayette.org. Thank you very much, all.
Finally, we must thank Bonnie for doing fantastic work on the technology.
Thank you,
Frick.
Bonnie.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.